Get ready to listen, learn, and earn CE hours. This podcast features content from an accredited CE activity provided by Calibri Healthcare. Visit elitelearning.com/podcasts for accreditation and disclosure statements and instructions on how you may be able to earn CE credits.
Leaders have a lot of power within a team, and people want to emulate the behaviors that they see in their leader. It's called mirror. Our mirror neurons, we actually mimic other behaviors we see as human beings, which is quite amazing. So yes, you're on stage, people are watching, but I want to say other members of the team can really influence that. And so you may not be the leader, but you can speak up in ways that perhaps get the attention of the leader and change the dynamic.
Hello and welcome to this podcast. Our podcast today is on overcoming common obstacles that teams encounter. I'm Leanna McGuire, your host for this elite learning experience. And we have two subject matter experts with us today, Bridget Sarikas and Kathy Scott. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Welcome back, I should say. Let's talk about today's topic. Any worthwhile project is going to encounter obstacles along the way, and these can often create conflict. So managing and or resolving conflicts effectively includes a variety of skills and strategies that build on what we've learned to date from the two of you. And this includes listening and empathizing with another's viewpoint, bringing disagreements into the open and de-escalating the situation, orchestrating win-win solutions by finding resolutions that each side can embrace, and staying engaged with the process of managing your own performance in the midst of conflict while holding each other accountable to the rules of engagement. So today we're going to explore the multiple sources of conflict. There's three parts to this discussion, and the first part in which we're going to discuss individual obstacles. So let's talk about individual obstacles, and we're talking about conflict, right? Is conflict always negative?
No, actually. Conflict is a fact of life, and if you get through life without having any, then I would really wonder about how much backbone you have. But that said, any group comes together, there's always going to be differences and conflicts that occur, and they can be healthy conflicts or constructive, and they can also be very unhealthy and destructive. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, starting with how do we create our own conflict.
Yeah, I think it's something great to remember too, because think about it, if we all agreed about everything and there was no conflict, it would just be quite boring, right? I mean, what are we learning? And it's great to be able to debate and have a different perspective. And sometimes that does lead to conflict, but how you resolve it can be pretty energizing as well, especially when you're both committed to resolving that conflict together. So can be worthwhile.
I mean, it sounds ideal not to have conflict, but I completely understand where you're going with that. So cooperation can exist with conflict is what you're saying.
Absolutely. They can easily coexist, and it may take a little skill, but yes. And we strongly encourage to really understand the sources of conflict so you can manage them better, especially when you're the person creating the conflict. So often we get our ego hurt, and that creates all sorts of dynamics in a group situation or team situation. And it's really getting yourself under control and management, and realizing this is my ego, and what is it that's bothering me so much about this, and what am I going to do about it?
Excellent.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just good to check that ego at the door, right? Before you sit down and you're with that team. Because with any kind of team dynamics, that ego can get in the way. So if you can just put it aside, for that period of time, it'll be much healthier, and the conversations will be much
Excellent.
healthier.
We'll talk a little bit more about ego in a couple of minutes. So tell me what do we need in order to differentiate between healthy conflict and not so healthy conflict?
Well, I would say unhealthy conflict is going to sabotage the team. You're creating a dynamic where people cannot move forward. And often, again, we're making it, rather than focusing on the goal, we're focusing on some hurt or harm that is getting in the way of the conversation. So even just think about being a professional. We're all trained in certain ways as professionals. We've had the same sort of schooling. So let's take nurses. 2 of us are nurses. And we have a common bond there. So our profession can, when we are threatened, can set up an unhealthy conflict in dealing with a team situation with another profession. So it's just good to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I also think when you're in the midst of that conflict, if you can find a way to really start focusing on the issue at hand, rather than me personally, and if you can take that me component out of it, I know that's easier said than done. But if you can get right to the core of the issue, that's usually much more healthy as well.
Do you think that, I know we call it ego, which it is, but is there some pride mixed in with that, or are they the same thing?
I think they're pretty much the same thing. And we want to think of ourselves in a certain way. That becomes our identity. Like, I'll just say, I'm a very intelligent person. Maybe that's your thing. And then when someone threatens that, or, makes a statement that makes you feel small or inadequate, it's very easy to get your dander up. And that's a wounded ego or pride. And we have to work on our own selves to move past that and start focusing on what's really important in the conversation.
Yeah, I think focusing on ourselves, though, sometimes that can be really hard, right? Because you have to be very emotionally and self-aware, and that is not always easy. So taking a deep dive, really looking at who you are, what are your triggers, what is causing some of that to occur or to you to react to something like that, that can be tough. So sometimes it's good to ask a friend to help you a little bit with that, but even that, you have to extend yourself a bit, and that can be really difficult for some.
Yeah, I would ask, do you know what your triggers are? Because the other people on the team know what they are. So it would be really good to invest in yourself and know yourself, be self-aware. You can save yourself a lot of conflict that way.
Right. And that identity or those triggers evolve from what with each of us?
That really comes from our childhood, our experiences through life, how we're raised, the culture, the variety of experiences that we have had throughout our life. And they really determine the way we view a situation, and they create these filters. And sometimes we see truth as one way and another person sees it as another way, because we're looking through those filters from those experiences.
Interesting.
I think it's good to, we always talk about leading with eyes wide open. I think that's when it's really important, going into any situation, if you can be open-minded a bit. But again, when you have those triggers, I mean, we all have them, right? There's no one who doesn't have a trigger somewhere in their life or have had them. If it's Kathy, God bless you. But I've had plenty.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yes, interesting. So our personal experiences, does the culture that we're working in, or the culture that our social culture certainly, but the culture we're working in, does that contribute in some way too?
Most definitely. And it's not like we have one culture that we work in. So just think health system. Night shift culture is very different than day shift culture.
Right.
Critical care culture is very different than perhaps a kinder, gentler unit or department. So yes, those norms, culture is the behavioral norms that are acceptable in that situation, in that organization. They definitely impact the way we think and the way we behave. And we need to be really aware of that. It's not that you have to give into that, but it's very easy to. So if it's an unhealthy culture, you have to be on your game. You have to pay attention.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think, as Kathy mentioned, especially speaking more on the clinical side, but also when you have, when I go into a healthcare system, I've always been part of the administrative part. So part of facilities, part of financial compliance, part of the real estate component. And quite often in those conversations, it's so different, and we forget the side of the clinical piece that is really so important, that drives so many of our decisions.
Yes, it is.
And so that reality check is so important. But those cultural differences can be huge. So you need to bring people together that are aware of that, that can have those really good conversations and bring everyone to the table.
Obviously,
Sure.
a well-functioning team has the openness for innovation and good decision-making. So talk to me about how conflict, good or bad, affects those things. Good decision-making, innovation, self-expression.
Well, a strong team that is able to work their way through those successfully has a high degree of psychological safety. So people are comfortable saying what they think and expressing themselves because the other team members, hopefully, are listening and paying attention. Even if they don't agree, they're willing to hear what you have to say. So that psychological safety component is really an important part of creating a team that can work their way through conflict. And if you're comfortable speaking up, other people are going to disagree and you will have conflicts, which is totally okay. It's about working your way through them in a constructive way.
And that psychological safety extends beyond that team meeting, that room, right? So when you leave that room, if, one member of the team really lashes out and says something highly negative and it gets back to the other individual, that psychological safety is blown.
Right.
And that's can bring the whole
Right.
team down.
So it sounds like...
Yeah, as
Go ahead.
well, as we often say, you need to be consistent on stage and off stage.
Oh, boy.
So in the room, out of the room, if you want to create that sort of safety with your team.
Excellent point. Excellent
Exactly.
point. It sounds like a bit of a snowball effect. So if a leader, it's a leader of a team, walks into a room and their sense of identity or their pride is threatened, that they will react in a negative way, which then affects the psychological safety of everyone else in the room. And they don't feel like they're in a position where they can express themselves. So it sounds like the leader's carrying the ball here. Am I right? To a degree?
Well, they certainly set the stage.
Okay.
You bet. Leaders have a lot of power within a team, and people want to emulate the behaviors that they see in their leader. It's called mirror. Our mirror neurons. We actually mimic other behaviors we see as human beings, which is quite amazing. So yes, you're on stage, people are watching, but I want to say other members of the team can really influence that. And so you may not be the leader, but you can speak up in ways that perhaps get the attention of the leader and change the dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think even even as others, when you leave that room, if you were uncomfortable, having a private conversation is always okay. But having that private conversation and saying, I've got your back, I'm going to go have a talk with so-and-so, that can be just as effective. But people knowing that you have their back, that team knowing that you have your back, can also help diffuse a lot of conflict.
Excellent. And basically, you don't have to be at the head of the team to be a leader. Isn't the definition of leading is basically having some kind of influence on others? Positive, we hope. So that's an important thing to remember as well. So that's a good point.
Absolutely.
And if we do make the mistake of letting our egos get in the way, and we do make comments that can potentially create some conflict, is it okay to admit that in front of the team?
I think it's a pretty good idea because they all know it happened, and you are a human being, and it's always helpful to say, "Wow, I shouldn't have said that. It was out of line. I'm not proud of myself right now, and I'm going to work on that." That is a huge, authentic statement to make. That gets people's attention, and it gives them permission to be honest about their own personal behaviors as well.
Yeah, I think that shows people your own vulnerability, which then people can really relate to you. You become very relatable, you become very real. And at the end of the day, that's what we all want to see. We all want to be able to relate to our leaders in some component. We don't have to be their best friends, but to be able to relate to them is really important. And those moments allow for that.
Yeah, I think there's some misconception that you have more strength if you don't admit your mistakes. But really, the strength is being able to admit your mistakes. Is that correct in your opinion?
Absolutely. And again, people know, people see it. And none of us have arrived at perfection. And when you make a mistake, it also gives your team, or if you have an area of weakness, it gives your team permission to step in and also assist.
Yes, nice.
So always good to keep it real, to create trust in the team. So your authenticism should really be directed at creating that trust with your team.
Yeah. And those kinds of moments really can diffuse the conflict. I mean, that can, the whole team can be in their tents. The leader comes in and says, gosh, I really messed up here. It really wasn't appropriate. I mean, the temperature just immediately comes way down, and that conflict seems to starts the ball rolling to be able to resolve.
Yes, so sounds like it's important to make vulnerability and especially authenticity our friends when it comes to team conflict. So that's excellent, and good to know that there are some good sources of conflict. Disagreeing and talking through that is definitely at that top of that list. Anything else you'd like to add before we complete today's topic?
Well, some people are much more comfortable with conflict based on the way they're raised, their personality, etc., and others are very conflict averse. So it's something you need to be aware of about yourself, and you may need to practice how you respond to different sorts of conflicts to be, get better at it. It can be very uncomfortable for some, so just keep that in mind. And as a leader, when you see a conflict, to call on a person to help them express themselves or work their way through the scenario that they're conflicted about.
Good advice.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think when you avoid conflict, eventually that comes back to really be very harmful to you in the end. It's not healthy personally, and it's most likely not helpful for the team either, or healthy. So the practice piece is really a huge component, but try not to avoid it.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much, Bridget and Kathy, for talking to us today about individual sources of conflict. This was part 1 of overcoming common obstacles that teams encounter. We will come back and talk about interpersonal sources of conflict in the second part of this series. This is Leanna McGuire for Elite Learning by Colibri Healthcare.
This podcast featured content from an accredited CE activity provided by Colibri Healthcare. Visit elitelearning.com/podcasts for accreditation and disclosure statements and instructions on how you may be able to earn CE credits. Take your learning to the next level by subscribing to more podcasts on compelling healthcare topics.